As we arrived in the entry chamber, Broderick stopped and turned to me. "Please tell me that whatever happens in this room, you will get out first." I swallowed and spoke my agreement, no matter what happens. He went and stood at the third door, hand on the door latch. I could see from his face that whatever was on the other side was doing its best to deter him from opening it. I sidled closer to Broderick, and instead of the despair he described, I felt relief. I tried not to think too much of it as he opened the door and inched inside. It was a long narrow room, with more shelves on the wall, and from the high ceiling hung hundreds of chains holding doll heads on meat hooks. I took a slow breath and stepped in after Broderick. He held his sword at the ready, weaving his head around all the doll heads. I stepped up to the first one to look more closely. The fabric was wrapped tightly against something hard, almost bony. "Don't touch them," Broderick warned. I looked at him and saw the anxiety lining his face. I nodded. The more I looked, the happiness I felt threatened to bubble up my throat, but that feeling in the air couldn't stop the horror from rising as I realized what they were. They weren't doll heads, they were children's heads, decorated, stuffed, and hung like trophies. I put my hand to my mouth as though my breath might disturb them, and weaved around each head as though they might start biting. At the end of the room, highlighted by the moonlight in the window, hung a large head. Unlike the rest, it was adult-sized, with a pointed chin and high cheekbones. His face was so well preserved it could have been a porcelain mask. A court jester hat was still placed on his crown, the bells gleaming at the end of each point. I turned to see if Broderick had seen the jester yet, but as I watched I noticed he was more interested in poking dust on a shelf than the hundreds of heads around us. I turned back to the jester's head and screamed. Its eyes were open black pits, and staring at me with a cruel smile tilted on its lips. Broderick was at my side in an instant, sword raised. "Holy shit," he muttered. As we watched the head stiffly started turning clockwise, a translucent body formed under his chin. We watched as he picked his head off the hook supporting him. "We're leaving," Broderick determined. Whether he said it to me or the apparition, I don't know. The jester started speaking anyway, its words like grease sliding through the dust. "With heavy courage me tale of woe, O daughter of Virgo, a sweven of three lunar sortish, a cheese to mark for life or death." The words hung in the air between us and the spectre. Broderick said over his shoulder, "What the fuck is he saying?" I shushed him. For every step we took back, the apparition turns his head another degree. I don't know why we did, but we paused. For half a breath we stopped moving. The jester dropped on all fours as its head turned completely upside down. It crawled at us, shrieking as it did. "The stone of son mortalita way to magic the self-haven fe. De mosta leve offringa." We were running now, barely dodging the swinging heads and almost out the door when the jester collapsed in front of us, uttering one last phrase. "Before the door of Tabernae." The body of the apparition went up in a shimmering cloud that set the dust rustling. The head lost all animation and slumped where it lay on the floor. I had one hand bracing the doorway, the other clenched in the back of Broderick's shirt. "Let's get out of here," I whispered to him before half dragging him out of the castle. Once we were out in the trees, we heard the familiar chirps of the night jays. A breeze cooled the panic sweat on my skin. I took a deep breath. Broderick was beside me, hand on his hips, gulping down air. "Let's agree not to talk to ghosts any more." I couldn't even understand what he was saying. "Could you?" he asked as he picked his bag off the ground where it lay. He took out his canteen and took a drink before leaning back on the wall of the castle. "It sounded like as good of a clue as we've got," I said, before taking off my bag and digging through it from my notebook. I wrote down what I remembered and asked Broderick if he remembered anything else. I read it over a few more times and said, "The Stolna of Solna must be what we found in his floorboards. Now I guess one of us must die in an offering at whatever the door of Tabernae is. Let's hope that we find something else that supports a non-sacrificial way to restore nature to its magical glory," Broderick said, as he closed his bag. I agreed and shouldered my things. We started to make our way to Lake Forpine, where we planned our next move in the restoration of magic. Thank you for listening.